The grand chamber of the Galactic Senate shimmered with authority. Columns of light cast slow-moving shadows across the polished obsidian floor. Holographic banners of the 300-member species rippled above their designated seats, each encoded with the emblem of a proud civilization. Silence held the room like gravity as the trade dispute hearing 982D resumed its third day. The delegation of the Moroxi, a crystalline species known for their rigid interpretation of trade law, had accused the tiny aquatic people of Valari 3 of violating export protocols. The Valari, who rarely spoke above a whisper, had barely managed to offer a defense. As per Senate tradition, the accused were expected to accept the arbitration findings. That was how it had always been, until now, from the human section recently. Granted observations to Toza, a tall woman in a slate gray suit, stood calmly. She didn't shout, she didn't wave for attention. She simply raised one hand and said clearly, with all due respect to the Moroxi delegation, "I would like to speak on behalf of the Valeri. I am a lawyer." The effect was instant and electric. Several delegates turned their heads. A few stood. One Charon ambassador, whose kind had no vocal cords but communicated through synchronized light pulses, blinked red in visible confusion. The high arbitrator, a soft-spoken being made of mist and color, shifted uneasily in the air. "I'm sorry, Terran, representative. You are." "What?" I said. "I am a lawyer," the human repeated, enunciating the words slowly as though they hadn't heard her. "A legal advocate. Speak on behalf of those unable or unwilling to defend themselves in formal argument." A low murmur spread through the room, first in whispers, then through translator devices. Whole rows of delegates leaned toward one another, repeating the word, "Lawyer, what is that?" Came the first clear voice from the tall, feathered senator of Johnny Prime. "She claims to speak for another species. That's against protocol. Humans assign champions to disputes," asked an Arthi delegate with a puzzled hiss. "No." Eliza Quinn said evenly. "Champions fight. I argue. With precedent, evidence, and reason." Another wave of murmurs followed. A few delegates chuckled, and possibly sarcastically began recording the moment for historical archives. "Objection. Sustained," the Moroxi said, rising and clicking their crystalline limbs together in irritation. "Terran interference is unauthorized. The accused party is responsible for their own words. This human seeks to disrupt proceedings." Eliza took a step forward, still composed. "I'm not here to disrupt. I'm here to offer a fair defense." The Valari were not given access to the full clause set of the trade compact, nor were they informed of procedural exceptions requested by the Moroxi Council last cycle. Several eyes narrowed. This was a specific allegation, one that implied not just error, but manipulation. "How do you know this?" the high arbitrator asked slowly. "I read the compact," Eliza replied. "All 8,423 sections, including the footnotes." Someone near the back let out a breath that sounded very close to laughter. The idea that someone had read all of it was absurd. But she didn't look like she was joking. "I request permission to submit an analysis for review," she continued. "I believe the Valari are not in violation, and I can demonstrate this if you allow me to proceed." There was silence for a moment. The Moroxi shifted uncomfortably. The Valari delegates looked up from their seats, wide-eyed, at last. The high arbitrator spoke. "This chamber has not seen such a request in over 4 centuries. But no protocol denies the accused the right to external counsel. The Terran may proceed." And just like that, the chamber shifted. The laws were unchanged, but someone had read them, understood them, challenged them. The galactic traditions had held for thousands of years, but now, one word liar had started to change everything. The Chamber of Oversight was smaller than the Grand Senate Hall, but no less imposing. Its curved stone walls bore inscriptions in dozens of languages, each marking a key moment in the long evolution of galactic diplomacy. The room had seen revolutions, treaties, and quiet compromises, but never anything quite like this. Eliza Quinn stood at the center of the circular floor, alone. Her hands were clasped behind her back, and her expression remained calm, almost curious, as she looked at the alien delegates surrounding her. Most sat behind raised desks arranged in concentric circles. Their glowing nameplates flickered in quiet discussion. At the head sat the Council of Customs, 5 senior members from 5 founding species. Each had served long enough to know the rhythms of galactic law. All of them now faced something that didn't fit into any rhythm at all. "You may speak." "Terran delegate," said the chairperson, a silvery being of translucent fibers, named Alec. "We ask again. Define this role you claim." "Lawyer." Elisa gave a polite nod. In human society, a lawyer is someone who studies law in depth, interprets it, and represents others who may not fully understand it, especially in disputes. "We act as advocates, a role assigned to the educated," asked a member of the Ferrati, a species whose entire legal tradition was based on inherited memory. "Not necessarily," Eliza replied. "We train, we qualify, but advocacy can be chosen, not born." There was a pause. "You claim to argue." "Not for your own interest," Alex said slowly, "but on behalf of others, without personal stake. In principle, yes. The fairness of the process is the stake." Another ripple of murmurs spread through the chamber. The Lutari representative, a soft-voiced species known for academic curiosity, leaned forward. "Would you consent to a demonstration?" "I would be honored," Eliza said. A brief consultation followed between the council members. Then Alex spoke again. "There is a pending dispute between the Malari Syndicate and the Gelathi Trade Accord. A minor case. The Malari accuse the Gelathi of fraud in energy reporting. The Gelathi have not formally responded and will likely submit to ruling." Eliza's eyes narrowed slightly. "May I speak with the Gelathi before the hearing?" Alec nodded. "You may have one rotation." The Gelathi were an aquatic race, communicating through pulses of light in gelatinous bodies. Translation required both patience and pattern recognition skills. Eliza had been practicing since Earth's first diplomatic exchanges. She met their delegation in a quiet side chamber. They hovered in a water-filled stasis field, clearly nervous. "You do not need to accept guilt if you believe you've done nothing wrong," Eliza said gently. "I've reviewed the energy export logs. Looks like a formatting error, not fraud." The Gelathi emitted a soft, bioluminescent flicker. It meant uncertain. "I'll speak for you," she said. "Only if you want me to." Their lights shifted again. This time, the meaning was clear. "Trust." The hearing was short but intense. The Malari presented their evidence, a list of mismatched data entries. Eliza listened without interruption, then stood and approached the council platform with a data crystal. She displayed her findings. The Malari had omitted part of the formatting code. The so-called error was due to outdated processing software. More importantly, she cited Section 41D, Clause 9 of the Data Exchange Charter, 8, overlooked, but still valid regulation that protected small trade groups from punitive action in such cases. When she finished, the chamber was silent. The council conferred briefly. "We find in favor of the Gelathi," Alec declared. No fraud occurred. The Gelathi glowed brightly in their field, a gentle shimmer of relief. The Malari narrowed their eyes but said nothing as Eliza stepped back. A quiet shift settled in the room, not of resistance, but recognition. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't accused. She had simply known the rules and used them better. And now, the chamber had witnessed something unexpected. Not power, not tradition. A well-made argument. 3 standard cycles had passed since Eliza Quinn won the Jelithy case, and the echo of that decision had not faded. If anything, it had grown louder. The Galactic networks replayed segments of the trial across hundreds of channels. Pundits from major powers debated what was more shocking, the clause she used, or the fact that she'd known it existed at all. In the quiet halls of the Terran diplomatic station, the requests began. First came the Kelsari miners, facing a debt claim from a megacorporation on Tal Vera. Then the storm-dwelling Maruk, whose planetary leases had been suspended for reasons they didn't understand. Species that had never spoken during Senate hearings now filed appeals to the humans. And always, they asked for the same person, Ambassador Quinn. Her assistant said one morning, entering with a glowing message tablet. Another petition. This one's from the Altani. Trade sanctions. They're asking if you'll represent them. Eliza set her tea down and rubbed her forehead. How many this week? 14? She smiled. That's only slightly fewer than yesterday. At first, the Terran embassy hadn't known what to do with the sudden attention. Eliza had been sent as an observer, not a legal representative. But Earth's diplomatic corps adjusted quickly, for permission from the Interstellar Cooperation Council. A special unit was created within the Terran delegation, the Office of Advocacy and Legal Affairs. Led by Eliza, it wasn't long before she realized she couldn't manage it alone. She contacted former colleagues from Earth legal minds from across the globe, fluent in treaty law, logic, and interpretation. They began arriving in waves. Together, they trained volunteers, studied galactic codes, and built a growing network of interspecies communication. They didn't carry weapons. They carried datapads, and in courtroom after courtroom, they won. The change did not go unnoticed. In the depths of the Darukan Empire's homeworld, a private meeting was held in the chambers of High Minister Rakesh. Screens showed recent hearings where human advocates had overturned previous sanctions, redirected trade routes, and even won back stolen land for a nomadic species. These Terrans are rewriting the rules, Rakesh muttered, mandibles clicking. In frustration, they are not rewriting, said his advisor. They are reading. That is worse. Another delegate added, the smaller worlds are rallying behind them. One law won't stop them. They know the laws better than the ones who made them. The Darukan were not alone in their concern. Several dominant species, those whose power had grown in silence and bureaucracy, now saw humanity not as a curiosity, but as a disruption. Back at the Terran office, Eliza stood before a wall-length screen covered in glowing threads. Each thread represented a case, open, pending, or resolved. She tapped one with her finger and zoomed in. The Altani request. Their export license had been revoked due to technical non-compliance. She'd seen that phrase before, vague, difficult to disprove, and usually used as a political tool. Do we have records from the licensing council? She asked. Partial logs only, her assistant replied. But I requested the full procedural archive. Eliza nodded. Start building the case. Let them know we're listening. The assistant hesitated. Is it always going to be like this? You win a case and 10 more show up. Eliza looked at the wall, at the growing web of voices, asking to be heard. Yes, she said softly. That's how justice works. Once someone finds a voice, others start to believe they have one. 2. Later that evening, as stars turned overhead, the Galactic Senate received a formal letter from the Terran delegation. It read simply, by existing statutes and confirmed precedent. All sentient beings under the authority of the Senate Charter have the right to petition and seek informed advocacy. We will continue to offer such advocacy to any who request it. Sincerely, Eliza Quinn, Legal Counsel, Terran Office of Advocacy, and so, with quiet determination, humanity continued its most unexpected campaign, not with fleets, But with facts, and for the first time in centuries, the rules began to matter again. The chamber was louder than it had been in a century. 1,000 voices echoed through the Grand Senate Hall, some raised in outrage, others in cautious support. Transcription drones hovered nervously above, struggling to keep up with overlapping conversations. Every display panel in the room flashed the same headline in a dozen languages. Proposal filed, Terran Framework for Legal Representation, the center of the room. Eliza Quinn stood with a simple datapad held in both hands. She had spoken only once, and only briefly. That had been enough. The Senate had been reacting ever since. The proposal she submitted was concise, only 50 pages by Galactic standards, but it was bold. It called for the official recognition of the right to advocacy. It included model procedures for hearings, standard definitions for evidence, and a recommended structure for neutral courts independent of political bias. More than anything, it asked for something unheard of: a right to be heard by someone who knows how to listen. This is an insult to thousands of cycles of tradition, declared High Senator Volkar of the Meraxi, voice resonating through a built-in amplifier. To replace noble arbitration with argument, with paid reasoning. She is not replacing, said the Lutari scholar calmly. She is clarifying. Are we afraid of clarity? A member of the Darukan Empire's delegation slammed a clawed hand on the desk. The Terran wants chaos. Give every species a voice, and none will listen. It will be the end of order. Across the chamber, a soft glow pulsed from the Gelathi pod. It is not the end, their translator said gently. It is the beginning. We were heard. For the first time, the debate stretched for hours. Lines were drawn, not just between governments, but within them. Some of the most established powers, the Darukan, the Meraxi, and the Johnny, pushed for an immediate vote to dismiss the proposal and censure the Terran delegation. But others, many of them smaller, often ignored, spoke in support. The result was a temporary deadlock. After the session, Eliza remained in the chamber. The lights had dimmed, and most delegates had left to debrief with their councils. Only a few stragglers remained, speaking quietly under the massive arched ceiling. She stood by the edge of the floor, quietly reading the carved names of the chamber's founders along the wall. You knew it would go like this, said a voice behind her. She turned to see Councillor Velrin of the Lutari, eyes blinking in slow thought. I knew it wouldn't. Be easy, Eliza replied. You've challenged their control. Not with threats, but with words. That scares them. They should be scared, she said softly. Not of me. Of what they've forgotten. Velrin tilted his head. And what's that? That power and truth aren't the same thing. Later that week, an encrypted communication reached the Terran embassy. It was unsigned, but clearly written by a high-ranking source. The message was short: cease further advocacy work immediately. But you're being watched. Eliza stared at the words for a long time, then calmly deleted the message. Her next hearing was scheduled for the following morning. Case involving planetary debt restructuring. For the Altani system. She had every intention of showing up. That evening, back in the Senate chamber, a question echoed in an emergency closed session. It came from the elder senator of Johnny Prime, who had remained silent through most of the debates. A veteran. Of 3 trade wars and countless votes, he leaned back in his chair and asked a single, quiet question. She called herself a lawyer. What? Is that? Really? No one answered him, but somewhere deep in the Terran records, there was one definition. A lawyer is someone who steps into the silence so others don't have to. And now, that silence was growing smaller with each passing day. The first protest began with 12 people. 12 delegates from 12 small systems, gathered outside the Senate Hall's reflection atrium, standing quietly beneath the mosaic dome. They held no signs, chanted no slogans, just stood in formation. each holding a single glowing orb. The symbol for incomplete judgment in old galactic law. By the end of the day, there were hundreds. Gelathi from the southern oceans, Kelsari, miners in sealed pressure suits, even some off-world Darukan scholars who defied their empire's orders. All stood in silence. They weren't protesting a war. They were protesting the lack of fairness. In peace, inside the Terran embassy, Eliza Quinn watched the newsfeeds scroll across the screen, her expression unreadable. The word lawyer had become a key word across the planetary networks. It was being spoken not just as a title, but as an idea, a force, a shield. The movements forming in her wake had named themselves after her work the jurist circles. What began as legal support groups were now coordinating peaceful resistance. They taught communities their rights, helped citizens draft petitions, and shared translated portions of the Terran advocacy framework. She hadn't asked them to form, but they had, anyway. "They're calling you a symbol," said her assistant, Jonah, placing a fresh cup of coffee on her desk. "Some of the smaller worlds are referring to you as the voice of Greylaw." "I don't want to be a symbol," she replied. "Symbols don't win cases. Facts do." Jonah smirked. "Try telling them that." The moment the movement truly shifted came from the planet Hylion. Long torn by conflict between two rival clans, the Array and the Volm. Their dispute had lasted over 2 centuries. Ceasefires never lasted. Treaties fell apart. But this time, both sides requested a third party to mediate the next peace summit. They requested Eliza. The Senate refused to send her. The Hylion clans refused to continue without her. A tense standoff followed. After 3 days, Eliza quietly boarded a civilian diplomatic shuttle under escort from the Gelathi and traveled to Hylion on her own terms. The peace summit took place in the shattered capital of Yora's cradle, inside a temporary dome just outside the ruins. Eliza entered with no weapons, no guards, only a sealed file case and her translator. The Volm opened first. They listed years of betrayals, claimed land rights, and pointed to ancient oaths. The Array responded with documents, emotional appeals, and even battlefield recordings. Eliza didn't interrupt. For 6 hours, she listened. Then she opened the case and presented a single unified document, a treaty written from scratch. Not based on past demands or political favors, but on the actual laws both clans still recognized, some of which had been forgotten. Some buried in obsolete legal texts. "You both believe in law," she said, "but neither of you trusted it. This treaty is built on what you already accept. You just never had anyone to bring it together." The leaders of both clans studied the pages in silence. By morning, they signed it. Not because they were forced. Because someone had listened reasoned, back at the Senate. The reaction was immediate and divided. She bypassed protocol, shouted a senior Darukan official. "She stopped a war," said a Lutari analyst. "She's becoming dangerous," muttered several others, but the one message that mattered most was simple. Sent from the Hylion summit itself, broadcast to all members of the Senate. "We have peace." For the first time in 7 generations, not because of power, not because of compromise, because of law. Because someone spoke for us. And with that, the balance shifted again. The question was no longer, what is a lawyer? Now the Senate faced a far more difficult question. What if the galaxy actually needs them? The order came in the night. By morning, the corridors of the Terran embassy were filled with Senate marshals in ceremonial armor. Their approach was silent, respectful, but firm. Eliza Quinn did not resist. She simply put on her coat, collected her case files, and walked with them through the high glass corridors toward the heart of the Senate, her destination. The Tribunal of Founders, a chamber used only in the most serious of internal cases. It had judged rogue delegates, declared planetary dissolutions, and once condemned an emperor. Now it would judge her. The charges were framed in complex language, but the message was clear: unauthorized diplomatic influence, disruption of procedural order, political destabilization. In short, she was being prosecuted for making the law work too well. The hall was packed. Observers from over 200 systems had arrived in person or through holofeed. The energy was tense, more like a battlefront than a courtroom. Eliza stood at the center alone, beneath the towering arch of judgment. "You have the right to speak in your defense," said the presiding judge, a neutral figure from the oldest known species in the Senate. Eliza gave a small nod. "I'll represent myself." Soft murmurs spread. Of course she would. The prosecution, led by a Darukan envoy and supported by Meraxi Council, presented their argument with cold precision. They detailed her appearances at protests, her unsanctioned mediation on Hylion, her increasing influence over weaker member states. "She does not follow law," the Darukan said. "She redefines it. A single species cannot be allowed to rewrite the spirit of galactic order." When it was her turn, Eliza stepped forward, slow and measured. "I didn't redefine anything," she said. "I read what was already there. Laws ignored. Rights buried under tradition. I didn't write them. I enforced them." A Jelithy observer blinked brightly in support. Several Altani delegates rose quietly from their seats. Around the chamber, the movement she had sparked stood in silent witness. She activated a projection behind her case files, treaties, dispute logs. Her voice remained calm as she reviewed 5 key cases. In each, she showed how the law had existed for generations but was never offered to those without power. "This isn't about law," she said. "This is about who's allowed to use it." Then came her boldest move. She requested an internal review of the tribunal's own authorities, citing procedural flaws in the Senate's emergency oversight clause. The chamber went still. "You are questioning us?" the presiding judge asked. "I'm asking you to prove your process is fair," she said. "The same way I had to prove mine was for the first time." The tribunal deliberated, not in private, but with the full Senate watching. Hours passed when the council returned. The presiding judge's voice was steady. On the matter of procedural disruption, the tribunal finds insufficient cause for censure. The accused operated within existing law. One breath, then a second, and on the broader matter, whether advocacy as defined by the Terran delegation has a place in Senate protocol, we defer. This decision belongs not to a courtroom, but to the full assembly. She had done it, not just defended herself, but forced the system to examine itself. That evening, as the stars rose over the city world of Virulon, thousands of lights shone from balconies and skylanes. They weren't protests. They weren't riots. They were quiet acknowledgments, flickering pulses of unity from system after system. The galaxy had seen something it hadn't seen in a long time. Someone stand against power with only reason and courage, and it had listened. The next morning, Eliza Quinn returned to work. There were still cases waiting, still voices unheard, still laws forgotten. But now, no one could say she didn't belong. The vote passed by a margin no one expected. On the 14th day after Eliza Quinn's trial, the Senate Assembly reconvened. Motion a 996 formation of a Galactic Council for Legal Advocacy and Representation was read aloud and entered into. Record? The chamber held its collective breath as the tallies came in. One by one, the lights turned green. Small systems, nomadic fleets, former colonies, quiet empires that had remained neutral for centuries. Their voices, once lost in procedure, now found power in something entirely new: shared law. When the final vote locked, The chamber erupted not with cheers, but with something deeper, quiet astonishment. For the first time in Senate history, a cross-species legal body had been formed by vote, not conquest, and the galaxy already knew who they wanted to lead it. The request arrived in the form of a simple data crystal, hand-delivered to the Terran embassy. On it, the official seal of the newly ratified Galactic Advocacy Council, an invitation to Eliza Quinn. In recognition of your service and vision, we respectfully offer you the title of Chief Legal Advocate of the Galactic Council. The position is yours to shape. Your legacy is already underway. She read the message in silence, then set the crystal down and turned to the window. Below, the lights of Virulon stretched across the horizon. Between the skyscrapers, small hovercrafts blinked, their navigation lights in quiet patterns moving in orderly, patient flow. Everyone below had somewhere to be. Everyone had a direction. Jonah, her assistant, stood nearby. They want you to lead it. I know, she said. You'll say yes. Eliza didn't answer right away. She walked slowly across the room to the long wall of case records, the same wall that had once held only Terran cases, now expanded with entries from 59 systems. I didn't do this alone, she said. They chose this. I just gave them a way to see it. That's exactly why they want you. 3 days later, she declined, not out of fear, not out of humility, but because she believed in something stronger. Lasting change must grow beyond one name. Instead, she accepted the role of founder and chancellor of the Quinn Institute of Law and Interstellar Justice, a non-governmental training academy chartered with Senate backing. Its mission to train legal advocates of every species in the shared codes of law and peaceful resolution. Admission would be open, funding would be distributed fairly, and lessons would be taught in dozens of languages. Within a single cycle, its first class had applicants from every quadrant. At the launch ceremony held in a peaceful valley on a neutral moon, Eliza gave a short address. She stood not behind a podium, but in a circle of students. I don't want to be remembered for how many cases I won, she said. I want to be remembered for how many people I helped prepare to win. Law isn't a weapon, it's a language. And now it belongs to all of us. The crowd rose in quiet applause. There were no banners, no anthems. Just the echo of truth passing between minds that had once never spoken. Back in the Senate, the power structures slowly began to shift. Larger empires found their influence challenged not through rebellion, but through careful legal review. Disputes that might once have led to skirmishes were now resolved through structured hearings. Delegates who had once ruled unchallenged now found themselves questioned, calmly, confidently, and with legal basis, and in every case, the quiet question lingered. Where did they learn that? The answer was always the same. They studied at the Quinn Institute. Eliza never sought titles, but in quiet corners of the galaxy. She became known by one, the first voice, not because she shouted the loudest, but because she taught others how to speak. Years had passed since. Eliza Quinn stood before the Galactic Senate as a lone advocate. Now, she watched as a new generation took the stage, advocates from every corner of the galaxy, fluent not only in language, but in law, justice, and hope. The Quinn Institute had become a beacon, a place where once forgotten codes were revived and new laws crafted. Graduates emerged with a determination to protect the unheard and uphold the balance between power and fairness. Eliza sat quietly in the back row of the Institute's grand auditorium, her eyes steady on the latest graduating class. She no longer needed to argue cases. Instead, she was here to witness the ripple she had set in motion. A young Maruk advocate stepped forward to receive their certificate. Voice steady, despite the enormity of the moment. "We stand on the shoulders of giants," the student said. And it was a giant among us who first showed that law is not a tool of domination, but a bridge between worlds. Eliza smiled softly, thinking of how far the word lawyer had come. What had once been a strange and unfamiliar term now carried meaning across star systems. It was a name that represented more than a profession. It was a symbol of courage, of fairness, and of hope outside the auditorium. News feeds buzzed with reports from the Galactic Senate. Procedures had been rewritten to reflect the new Council for Legal Advocacy's recommendations. Committees of mixed species debated openly and with respect, recognizing that every voice carried weight. Every right deserved protection. Eliza's quiet revolution had reshaped politics not through force, but through respect for law and reason. 1. Evening, after a day full of meetings, Eliza returned to her quarters. Her datapad blinked with messages, requests for advice, invitations to speak, questions from new advocates. She replied thoughtfully, knowing that her role was no longer to carry the burden alone, but to guide those who would. Her thoughts drifted to the Senate, now more a forum of dialogue than conflict. The question that had haunted the hall's years ago lingered still, but now it was met with a new answer. A lawyer is one who steps into the silence so others don't have to. Eliza often thought of that line, but now it no longer felt solitary. The silence was shrinking, filled with voices trained to speak, argue, listen. In the quiet of the night, a visitor arrived. Counselor Velren of the Lutari, now an old friend, came with news from the outer sectors. There is peace where there was once war. Disputes resolved with dialogue rather than arms. The galaxy is changing. Eliza nodded. Because the people believe in justice. Velren smiled. Because you showed them how. They shared a quiet moment of reflection, understanding that the work was never finished. But the path was clearer. Years later, in classrooms filled with students from dozens of species, the story of Eliza Quintha's forced voice was told not as legend, but as history. The term lawyer was no longer met with confusion, but with respect and pride, as the twin suns set over the Quinn Institute. Eliza stood outside, watching the stars awaken one by one. The galaxy was far from perfect. Old wounds still lingered. New challenges awaited. But the future was brighter, because now, wherever there was silence, someone would speak. And that was the true legacy of the first voice.